India's religious landscape is one of the most complex and dynamic in the world. It's a topic that inspires a lot of conversation, for sure, but what do the numbers actually tell us about how it's evolving? Okay, let's dive into this using official census data and a really interesting long-term study to get a clear, data-driven picture of the demographic shifts happening across the nation.
Here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll start with the big picture, India's overall religious makeup. Then we'll zoom right in on the numbers to see the regional diversity. After that, we're going to compare the growth stories of two very different communities, broaden our view with a 65-year analysis, and then finally wrap it all up with the key takeaways.
So, first things first, we need to set a baseline. To really understand where things are going, we've got to know where they stood at the time of the last big count, which was the 2011 census of India.
I just love this quote from the Census of India itself. It uses the word kaleidoscope, and honestly, it's the perfect metaphor. It frames the country's incredible diversity not as some simple list of groups, but as this rich, intricate, and constantly shifting pattern.
So, here's what that pattern looks like in the broadest sense. According to that 2011 data, Hindus make up the majority at almost 80%, followed by Muslims at just over 14%. Christians, Sikhs, and other groups, well, they combine to make up the rest. This chart right here gives us a really powerful visual anchor for everything else we're about to explore. All right, let's move on because this is where it gets even more interesting. As you can probably guess, those big national averages don't even come close to telling the whole story. India's religious communities aren't just spread out evenly. They are concentrated in some really fascinating ways across different regions.
Okay, so here we see the 6 major communities listed out by their share of the population. You've got Hindus and Muslims at the top, of course, then Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. But just look at how small a percentage some of these major ancient communities represent, like the Jains at just 0.37%.
Now, what's so interesting about this slide is how it just completely dismantles that national average we just saw. While Muslims are about 14% of India's population overall, look at this. They form an overwhelming majority in Lakshadweep and a clear majority in Jammu and Kashmir. And in states like Assam, West Bengal, and Kerala, they make up a really significant chunk of the population.
And this isn't just about one group either. Here's another powerful example of that same regional concentration. Christians are just over 2% of the national population, right? But they are the majority religion in 3 separate states in the Northeast, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Meghalaya. This really drives home the diversity within India's minority communities themselves.
Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating part of this whole story. To get a real feel for the demographic shifts, we can't just lump all minorities into one single group. So what we're going to do now is look at the very, very different demographic journeys of 2 communities.
First, let's look at the data for India's largest minority community. So between the 2001 and 2011 census, the Muslim population grew by 24.6%. And now for comparison, during that exact same decade, the Hindu population grew by 16.8%. So putting those two numbers right next to each other, well, it shows a clear difference in the growth rates between the country's 2 largest religious communities.
But that's just one part of the story. Now let's pivot and look at a community with a completely different set of numbers, the Jains. They are one of India's oldest religious groups, and their demographic profile is, well, it's totally unique.
And this right here perfectly illustrates just how different these stories can be. The Jain community is the smallest of the 6 major groups we saw. But get this, they have the highest literacy rate in the entire country. At the same time, they've got the lowest total fertility rate and the highest proportion of their population in senior age groups. It paints this picture of a highly educated community that's also facing some real demographic challenges with an aging population. Okay, so everything we've looked at so far has been based on census data, right? Kind of like a snapshot in time. But what happens when we pull the camera way, way back? We're going to zoom out for the long view with a recent working paper from the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, or EACPM. This study analyzes demographic changes over a much longer period.
And just so we're all on the same page, the EACPM is an independent body. Its job is to provide economic and policy advice to the government. So what we're doing here is simply presenting their findings as they reported them in their paper to get this longer-term perspective.
So this study covers a really critical 65-year period in India's history. It starts in 1950, right after independence, and goes all the way up to 2015. And looking at a span like that lets us see trends that you just wouldn't catch in a single census decade.
So what did they find? Well, according to the EACPM paper, over these 65 years, the share of the Hindu population in India actually went down from 84.68% in 1950 to 78.06% in 2015. That's a drop of about 7.8% in their slice of the total population pie.
Now, during that exact same period, the report finds that the share of the Muslim population went up. It went from 9.84% back in 1950 to 14.09% in 2015. The report notes this as a 43.15% increase in their share of the population.
But it's not just a story of two communities. The study also looked at other minority groups. The share of Christians, Sikhs, and Buddhists, they also increased. But the share of Jains saw a small decrease, and the Parsi population saw a really sharp decline of 85% in their share over that 65-year period. It just goes to show you the trends are not uniform across the board. And the report puts all this into a wider context, which I think is really important. The authors contrast the trend in India with many of its neighbors. They point out that in countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, the population share of the majority religion actually increased during a similar period, while in India, as we just saw, the share of the majority religion decreased.
Okay, wow. We have looked at a ton of numbers from different sources and different time frames. So let's just pull back for a second and summarize the really crucial points that all this data is telling us about India's religious demographics.
So what are the big takeaways? First, India is a deeply diverse nation, and those national averages, they hide some pretty huge regional differences. Second, the demographic stories of its many communities are not the same at all. They show vastly different patterns of growth, education, and age. And third, that long-term 65-year analysis shows a clear decrease in the majority Hindu population share, alongside an increase in the share for most minority communities.
And the authors of that EACPM report, well, they offer their own interpretation of these findings. They write, and I'm quoting this directly from their paper, contrary to the noise in several quarters, careful analysis of the data shows that minorities are not just protected, but indeed thriving in India. So that's their conclusion, based on the population trends they analyzed.
And all of this brings us to one final thought. The data paints a complex, evolving picture, right? So as India continues its journey as the most populous country on Earth, the really big question remains, what do all these ongoing, multi-layered demographic shifts actually mean for the future of its unique social fabric? It's a question the data really prompts all of us to think about.